Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to our continuing update series on the coronavirus. We do this every Tuesday at noon. We're pleased that you're with us. Thank you to our clients and friends for working with us throughout this unprecedented situation. We're going to jump right in today. We've got an ambitious agenda as usual. I'm Pete Jones. I am a partner in our Syracuse office. Just a couple of quick administrative items. You will see at the end of this a survey. Those are very helpful to us, so please, if you just take a minute, fill that out, that would be great. Secondly, we'll try and get to your questions, but time being what it is, we may not get to them today. Sometimes we answer them in the course of this, but feel free to contact us afterwards if we're not able to get to your question. Call your favorite bond attorney or email, and we'll try and get back with you. With that said, we're going to start off today with Caitlin Anderson. Katie's in our Albany office and is tracking on a weekly basis, you know, what's going on in Albany, and it really is a daily basis because things happen 7 days a week. So Katie, take it away.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I know you had to choose between probably watching the governor versus watching us. So thank you to all of you for being here. I really do appreciate it. So if we could take a look at the next slide. We had a lot to do this week, and it was again a whirlwind week. And it only seems to, the pace only seems to be quickening it sometimes. So just an overview of what happened this week. First, you're looking at Executive Order 202.31, and that puts the reopening into, the reopening provisions into place. Then you have, regions are beginning to reopen. Today is the first day that Western New York is reopening. Capital Region, we're not sure when it's going to be reopening, and because that hasn't been officially announced. Looking to reopening guidance, that has been issued, since the last time I spoke on this. And then you had updated guidance from Empire State Development. So it's a lot of stuff for us to look at, and we're going to look at it kind of in reverse. We're going to look first at the updated essential business guidance. The reason, that I want to put this up there is it's important for you to take a look at this, especially because the governor's office seems to be updating, Empire State Development is updating this guidance even while reopening is occurring. So that is important because essential businesses are, they're not exempt from the reopening guidance, but they can operate, regardless of what phase you are in your region for reopening. So, the fact that they are changing the guidance does indicate that, going forward, these are going to be considered those essential activities that will occur. You look at tennis and golf courses now are going to be opening. We're going to, I expect we'll be looking at some more recreational activities will be added to that list at some point. So turning then to Executive Order 2.31, this extended New York on pause to May 28th, but it also laid out officially what New York forward is, supposed to be looking like. Basically, it says that phase one industries are exempt from the reductions and restrictions on the in-person workforce. What that means is, if you are a phase one industry, the executive orders about New York on pause, about who can be in your workplace, the workplace restrictions, those don't apply. But that doesn't mean that there aren't restrictions, and there aren't things that you have to be doing and what you have to be following. And we're going to cover that. Don't you worry. It also extends the enforcement of executive orders to June 13th, excuse me. So then, turning to reopening guidance. This was issued by the state. I believe last week I put forward the link of forward.newyork.gov. There are quite a few links on this slide. I will push them all to you all during the chat when I'm done talking, so that you can access them before the slides come out. But those links are very important for you to take a look at. The first link has this New York Forward reopening lookup tool. That will tell you, you put in your industry's NAISC code, and you put that in, and it'll tell you whether or not you can operate either as an essential business in a region or as a phase 1 entity. And so that has been very helpful this week. Second, you have the industry's reopening by phase. That puts forward this guidance that's on the other side of, the other column, these summary guidelines, the detailed guidelines, and the plan template, the safety plan template. All of that is very important to take a look at, even if you're a later phase business. And I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's very, it's critical for you to take a look at that. And then finally, you have the Empire State Development frequently asked questions. Those are informative because it applies this reopening guidance to essential businesses. And what does that mean then? We're taking a look at, what is it that you really need to know in a few words about reopening. First things first, again, the guidance applies to essential businesses. That has been explicit by Empire State Development. Once guidance is posted about your industry, your business, your not-for-profit that's applicable to you, you need to read and affirm that you're operating in accordance with that guidance. So that is, that's a big change for essential businesses, and something that, you're going to want to be looking at. The affirmation that's submitted to the state is, it says that 1, you have a plan in place, and that 2, you're operating in accordance with that guidance. So what does that mean? This guidance has, 2 things that are very significant to take a look at. And this is taken from the manufacturing guidance. Again, we don't know at this point what it will look like for phase 2 guidance, but the manufacturing guidance tends, and the construction guidance, it tends to show us where we're going. So looking at the occupancy restrictions, for work that's occurring indoors, the workforce presence has to be limited to 50% of the maximum occupancy for that area, and that's set by your certificate of occupancy. That's big, and that's something to remember. There is an exception to it, but that exception, I will say this, up front, this exception should not be something that is, going to be used willy-nilly. This is an exception to the rule, right? And it's, if the facility needs more employees to safely operate core functions, then this 50% occupancy requirement does not apply. So there's no definition of what operating core functions means. The guidance uses the example of a critical assembly line. And that, hopefully we'll get more, explanation of what that means. But in the meantime, this is an exception. Don't try to use this willy-nilly. And again, there's an additional requirement now in this guidance that's separate from the executive orders, right? The guidance says that face coverings must be worn by employees when social distancing cannot be maintained. So employees, if they can't maintain social, 6 feet of distance from each other, they have to be wearing a face covering. And the level of that face covering, as we've covered in previous webinars, that's going to vary based on, what your industry is, because of OSHA requirements. So, that is very important to remember. And finally, and this is what Sam is going to talk about next. So you'll be in good hands. But looking at your plan, right? Your plan has to have protections, has to look at the layout. You have to be adaptive with what you're doing, how you're going to be using these strategies. And finally, again, most important thing, put down what you're doing in writing. when the state asks for what you're doing, you want to be able to say, you don't want it to be a flurry of, we have to write down everything that we're doing right now. You want to be able to just send it right over very quickly, and so that you can continue to operate. And with that, my piece is done.
So, Katie, a few questions here, and this may overlap a little bit with what Sam's going to talk about, but we're getting questions on what happens if you're an essential business and you're already operating. The affirmation requirements, the plan, requirements, and I think that the state has been clear in the most recent guidance that there's an expectation that essential businesses and public employers who are currently operating will comply with the standards that are stated here. That may be easy if you're in an industry where there's an explicit plan like construction or manufacturing. It's a little bit more unclear at this point when we've got, if you're in a different industry and there's no plan specific to your industry yet, although the plans across the various industries are very similar. So do you have a quick comment on that before we turn to Sam?
Yeah, and I think Hermes will be discussing this a little bit too in the looking forward of reopening segment. But what we have to work on right now is that frequently asked question from Empire State Development that says, until you have guidance that applies to your industry, that is when you will have to affirm that you are in compliance with that guidance, right? That guidance that will be issued at some point. So the guidance that has been issued, while it's not going to be directly on point for most industries outside of the ones that are listed in phase 1, they're very useful to take a look at, because when you look at you compare the construction to the agriculture and forestry or fishing, commercial fishing guidance, they're very similar, right? They're all using, even though those are two wildly different industries, they're using very similar language. So it shows us a very good indication of where we think things may be going. Next week, I could be up here talking about something, it could be totally different, but that's our best guess right now.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to Sam, Sam Burgess in our Syracuse office. Sam's going to talk a little bit about the phase 1 reopening for those regions where you're able to open, and for those regions who are looking forward to reopening, hopefully in the near future. Sam, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. I want to start with just by emphasizing some of what Katie said. How we have 6 regions right now that are entering phase 1, and hopefully, the capital region, a few others will be shortly thereafter. The phase 1 is the phase that we've all seen for the last week or so: the construction, agriculture, retail, curbside pickup, manufacturing, and wholesale trade. And now with that, as we're reopening, again, going off what Katie said, you have to have a reopening plan in place. Before you're open, you have to have affirmed the detailed guidelines, like she said, and also have a reopening plan. So I'm going to kind of touch on what the reopening plan entails and kind of what you can do to get your business ready. So contrary to what we kind of thought before, the reopening plan does not have to be submitted for approval. You just have to have it available if you're inspected, and it has to be complete. The detailed guidelines are where you're going to affirm what you're actually doing and that you're complying with all the terms and conditions at this time. So the template safety plans, these are the bare minimum that the state's requiring. They are set up with check boxes to say you're doing different things, but then they also have blanks for information that you have to include. This is going to be specific to your business. It's going to be specific information regarding the process that you're going to put in place, the people who are going to be in charge of certain processes, and some other information that we'll get into here. So with the reopening plan, and again, talking on phase 1, like Katie said, most of them are identical, the templates. And they're broken down into 3 different parts. It deals with people, places, and process. So with people, you have to ensure that you're maintaining social distancing. And this is something we've harped on for the last several weeks. So we're all pretty much on board with, what's that's covering. Make sure people stay the 6 feet apart. But again, if they cannot maintain that distance and they have to be near each other, they must be wearing a face covering. Also, limit gatherings to the extent you can. Use video teleconferencing. If you're conducting meetings, do it in a well-ventilated area or an open space if able. Also, establish pickup and drop-off areas for deliveries, packages, things of that nature, so people aren't coming in and out of your work area. The next part is about the places. And ironically, the first portion of that deals with people. It deals with the fact that face coverings have to be provided to all employees. Just like essential businesses had to provide them for their employees at no cost, the same thing must be done here in the reopening. Also, it has to be determined how you're going to properly dispose or clean of these items. So whether it's cloth face coverings that you're going to mandate are washed every day, or you have disposable ones that are going to be thrown in the trash each day, you have to make sure that's made known and that you have an adequate supply of face coverings. Then we're going to make sure we limit the sharing of objects, supplies, tools, shared surfaces, things of that nature. And to the extent that we can't, we have to make sure that we're cleaning the space or the object before and after use, and also that our employees are sanitizing, washing their hands after the use. Our business has to make sure that we're following all CDC, DOH hygiene standards, providing the hygiene stations with, whether it's hand washing stations, hand sanitizer, we have to make sure those are all available for our employees. Then in the cleaning aspect, some more guidance is provided on this, that cleaning has to be done at least every shift or every day. And it's also should be done in high use areas more frequent if possible. Your common areas, break rooms, bathrooms, things of that nature. And to that point, you have to contain a log of the cleaning. You have to document the date, the time, the scope of cleaning, so that it's on site if you're ever inspected. Next with the places, we're going to deal with communication. First, we're going to communicate with our employees, visitors, and others regarding the expectations when they come into our workspace, policies we've put in place, etc. Some of this is going to be done through signage. We're going to put signage up regarding proper hygiene, maintaining social distancing, cleaning, disinfecting, wearing face coverings. And then to go along with this communication, and this is kind of going to go to our later part with contact tracing, is we're going to contain a log of the individuals on site. We need to know the workers that are there, the visitors that are there for the extended period of time. There's limited exceptions. We don't have to document, delivery people, individuals that stop in quickly to drop something off that have proper face coverings, proper protective equipment. So finally, the last part of the plan, like I said, is the process. And this goes to the screening of the employees. There has to be a questionnaire or temperature check on a daily basis. And this is key. Before the individual begins work, it has to be conducted. You have to find out if the individual, anytime in the past 14 days, has had COVID-19 symptoms, has tested positive for COVID-19, or has been in close contact with a confirmed or suspected case of COVID-19. And with these responses, there has to be an individual in charge of reviewing them and then documenting the review. So whether it's your HR person, someone else that you designate, someone has to be there to review all the responses and make sure that no one's coming in after checking yes to any of these answers. Then there has to be a plan to contact trace. Kind of like I talked about before, we're containing our log of visitors, employees, but we're going to contact the local health department, work with them, cooperate into the contact tracing as possible. And then finally, you're going to clean and disinfect after the confirmed case. You're going to follow proper guidelines to clean and disinfect. Make sure what areas you're going to clean, disinfect. You may want to close down a certain area where an employee was, if possible, and make sure certain things are cleaned up to standards. And again, I just want to emphasize, these are the bare minimums that have to be done. There are other things you can be doing to make sure you're providing the best protections for your employees and any visitors, and making sure the processes are put out there in a manner that are specific to your business and are not relying on just this template from New York State. You have to make sure that you have the individuals in place and the process in place specific to your industry, and then specific more to your subspecialty or your office itself. So with that, I'll turn it back to Pete.
Thanks, Sam. I'm going to go right to Hermes here because I think it's nice if we have sort of phase one, which is where we are in a lot of places, and what's next. We'll marry those two up, and then maybe do a few questions that relate to both. So let me turn it to Hermes right now.
Ruined the timing, Pete. I had to unmute. So thank you, everyone. I've been given the task of telling you what's to come, which is like being given the job of being the television weatherman. I have to give you a forecast. Hopefully I'm going to be right. And if I'm not, hopefully you'll forget. So let's go to the first slide. Here's what I do know is going to happen. Once we get to phase two, people are getting haircuts. Let's go to the next slide. New hairdos, haircuts, and let's go to the final slide. People will be out and about. I expect to see quite a few people sunburned. Those are my predictions that I'm 100% sure will be correct. Let's go to the next slide. After that, we really are trying to figure out what's coming and how we do it. So we've talked about this before. You've seen this slide before if you've been on these presentations. Sam was really talking about it. Six regions of the state are in phase one. And thanks to Katie Anderson's good offices, I can tell you that the capital region is going to be reopening tomorrow. The governor announced that today while we're on this, while we're delivering this webinar. So we have seven areas of the state open. And what does it mean to be open, right? Really, when we're talking about being reopened, we've talked about things you're going to have to do in terms of your business, right? We've laid those out. The path is there. New York Forward is present. There's lengthy lists of steps that we all must take. But various areas of the state now it's going to create confusion because various areas of the state are not open. We are all going to be traveling this path at different speed, different times, right? So I believe we are really going to be talking about quite a bit of confusion. Let's go to the next slide. Here's our regions again. Now, if you look at it, essentially what we've got is Western New York soon to come, region one, and then the downstate area, the lower Hudson Valley, Westchester in particular, New York City, Long Island, all yet to begin the phases. Mayor de Blasio of New York City said yesterday he doesn't expect New York City to be entering phase one until mid-June. So we really are talking about a staggered opening throughout the state, and we'll be talking past each other to a certain extent as we talk about what we are doing, when we are doing it. Let's go to the next slide. Where we're really going to be, and I think in terms of the keys to opening and staying open, right? What are we going to have to do? We've listed what businesses are doing, but what do we do to need to remain to stay open? Because we're moving forward optimistically. We're moving forward assuming that the phases are going to happen, that the phases are going to happen in a ordered way, in a measured way, with the governor saying each phase is going to happen on a 2-week timetable. We're starting already to forget that the governor is also talking about the fact that you can slide backwards, right? That phases don't have to happen on a 2-week basis, that there could be outbreaks, right? There could be circumstances where the number of deaths go up, the number of hospitalizations go up, where we have an outbreak, right? We're seeing that in other parts of the country right now where there are numbers going up, where we're seeing numbers going down in New York State, we're seeing numbers going up elsewhere. So what's going to happen, what will happen, right, is we are going to have to maintain social distancing, right? At work, at home. right? In public. We're going to have to wear masks, facial covers, whatever it is, bandanas, but those are going to be required. We're going to keep those in place for quite some time. We're going to be seeing screening continue in businesses. We're going to see screening continue in office space. We're going to see screening happening at retail locations, right? We can see some of that already when we look at what's happened in Florida, Texas, elsewhere. How do you get to come into a business? Why is someone going to want to come into your business? People, for the most part, are going to want to know they're being kept safe. People are going to have a competitive advantage when they can show that if you come to my business, you are not going to leave with the coronavirus, right? We've screened. Our staff is healthy because we haven't allowed unhealthy staff to come to work. We're not allowing unhealthy customers to come to work. That could cause some issues. We've already seen it, right? It can cause some conflict where customers may show up and say, how dare you? You must let me in. Workforce, the same thing. And then configurations are going to be very, very important, right? Configuration in terms of how do you set that restaurant seating? Sam talked about it. What do we do in the office? How do you set up the offices? How do you set up your assembly line? How do you set up the beach? If pools are open, right? And pools are not on any list at this point in New York State to open. I'll be surprised if they're open before the 4th of July. But if pools are open, right? How do you configure the space? Where do the seats go? All of these things. We've talked about configuration is even in terms of sports, right? Some sporting events seem to be on their way to occurring, but they're going to occur without fans. That's a configuration, right? The players on the field, the players on the court, no fans in the stands. And then the other keys to opening and staying open, we're coming back to the Tom Frieden piece. Tom Frieden is the former New York City Health Commissioner, former commissioner of the Center for Disease Control. And this is what CDC has recommended. It's what the governor has embraced. It's what we're hearing in other states to be embraced, right? The 4 steps to prevent outbreaks. Testing. If you have a positive test, you're isolated. Tracing the individuals who may have proved to be COVID positive, and quarantining those individuals who've been exposed to an individual who've been COVID positive. Those are all extremely important to staying open. Let's go to my last slide. The other pieces in terms of open and staying open, no attractive nuisances, right? The governor's been big on this, and it's kind of been buried a little bit in a lot of his comments lately. It's something I think we're kind of forgetting about. Places that are going to bring people from outside of your area are going to be kept closed, right? That's why we see no crowds at sporting events. No or limited public gatherings, right? The core of our closing, apart from closing businesses, has been no public gatherings. I put wearing masks up again because you just can't say it enough. And then the real question for me is, can we keep up the good work? Can we, and is good behavior sustainable, right? Are we all going to keep washing our hands, right? Are we all going to keep grabbing for the bottle of sanitizer? Are we all going to keep wearing masks? We're already seeing, and I don't want to bring politics into it, but politics is going to play some role in this because we're seeing a political divide about what is it fair to expect of me? Right? What can you tell me I must do, and why do I have to do it? Right? And once we start to see openings, are people going to believe that there's a need to maintain distance? Right? Are people going to believe there's a need to do all these other things because they're getting a signal that it may be okay? I expect businesses will behave very differently than the public will, right? I know our law firm, Schoeneck King, we're going to have very strict rules in the office. We've been talking about them. I expect most of you on the phone on this presentation will be strict in your operations. But as we see places where the public is interacting with the businesses, it's going to be very hard to maintain those pieces. We're seeing age differences, right? We're seeing people who are younger, right, very readily going out. That happened yesterday in New York City, right? Great amounts of drinking outside of bars, right? Are people going to follow these rules? And if they don't follow the rules, are we going to backslide into reclosing? So that's my presentation for today. Thank you, Pete.
Thanks, Hermes. Let's go to Aaron. Aaron is going to talk about some of the employment related issues that we're facing as we reopen as well, kind of the third part in this series. And then we're going to finish with Jeff today. Jeff Shear is going to talk about PPP program updates and things of that nature. So let's start with Aaron. Aaron, take it away.
Thanks, Pete. We've spent the last half hour talking a lot about reopening and what reopening is going to look like for our employees, for our customers. And an issue that we've started to pay some attention to is, well, we focused a lot on the physical aspects of COVID. We have to do the wellness checks of our employees, making sure that our employees are physically okay. The pandemic has also had a great impact on people's mental health. And as workplaces begin to reopen and we adjust to this new normal of what our workplaces will look like, employers have to understand that there may also be issues that they are dealing with their employees on the mental health side of things. Just anecdotally, I, as well as many of my colleagues, have received questions about employees who are scared to come to work. On a more personal level, in talking to some of my friends, and I have family members who are scared to go outside, who are scared to return back into the public setting because they're afraid either of catching the virus or of spreading it unknowingly to people they love. So the mental health aspect of returning to the workplace, I think, is an issue that employers are going to have to grapple with. And while we're focusing on the physical aspect right now, I think we need to be aware that as we begin to reopen and have more interaction with one another, there may be the mental health aspect of this that you as an employer may have to deal with. So in my segment, I want to talk very quickly and provide a very broad overview of what some of our obligations as employers may be to address the mental health side of things. We are actually doing a more in-depth presentation on this topic on Thursday. So this will be a broad overview and introduction into that presentation on Thursday, but I thought it was important to begin the conversation in this more truncated fashion today. And I want to make sure that I leave enough room or enough time for Jeff to talk about the PPP loan forgiveness, because I know that's on a lot of people's minds. So as many on this call, if not all on this webinar, are aware, federal and state law requires us as employers to engage in the interactive process and provide reasonable accommodations for those employees who have disabilities. And we have to provide an accommodation, a reasonable accommodation, where that accommodation would allow the employee to perform the essential function of their job. So therefore, when we're talking about mental health conditions, we may have an obligation, if that mental health condition is meets the definition of a disability under federal or state law, to provide a reasonable accommodation to that employee. The EEOC has issued in some of its recent guidance concerning the various pandemic issues, it's acknowledged this notion that there may be employees who are struggling with mental health issues. And in some of its guidance, the EEOC has specifically recognized that there are employees with certain conditions, including anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, as well as others, that may have more of a difficulty in dealing with COVID-related issues. The pandemic may be triggering certain issues, or it may be exacerbating certain mental health conditions. And the EEOC has advised employers to remember that if you may have an obligation to accommodate those conditions. So we have to be aware that if you have an employee who comes to you and indicates that they have a mental health condition that has been either triggered or exacerbated by COVID-19, that you may have an obligation to provide a reasonable accommodation. So you want to begin the interactive process which is really just a formal word for a dialogue. You need to begin communicating with that employee, asking questions about the condition to determine whether or not it is a disability under federal or state law. You may have to request some medical documentation from the employee's doctor to substantiate the need for an accommodation and to figure out what accommodation may be reasonable, may be appropriate. You'll want to talk with the employee about what accommodations may help that person to perform the essential functions of their job. And you may have to explore various alternative accommodations if the particular or the specifically requested accommodation might not work for you as the employer. Is there another accommodation that would allow the employee to perform the essential functions of their job? Some possible reasonable accommodations that you may have to consider, maybe an altered break schedule, a quiet office space, perhaps a different work assignment, maybe possibly altered equipment or clothing, supervisory flexibility, remote work, or unpaid leave. What might be a reasonable accommodation for one employer might not be reasonable for another. So this is really a case-by-case, fact-specific inquiry and requires a dialogue between you and the employee. And then the last thing I want to mention about this is outside of any obligation you may have under the Americans with Disabilities Act or the state law to provide a reasonable accommodation, always have in the back of your mind that the FMLA may also provide the employee with the right to take either a block of leave or intermittent leave to deal with mental health issues so long as they rise to the level of a serious health condition under the FMLA. And then beyond that, also remember that if an employee is caring for a family member with a mental health condition that is either triggered by or exacerbated by the pandemic, they may be entitled to leave under either the FMLA or the PFL to care for those family members. So with that, it's a very broad intro, quick overview of some of the issues you may have to think about as employees start re-entering the workforce. Again, we're having a follow-up webinar on Thursday, which will go much more in depth on many of these issues. And with that, I will turn it over to Pete, back to you, or is it to Jeff?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Thanks. Yeah, and I think worth noting, we're having a number of pop-up webinars. In fact, they're happening so frequently that we don't always have time to mention them, even in this weekly webinar, because we decide to do it on let's say Tuesday afternoon, and we might do it on Thursday. So anyway, please be on the lookout for notices of those on issues that you find of interest. This is our sort of broad summary webinar, and then we try and drill down a little bit more in the individual pop-up webinars. Okay, let's turn it over to Jeff. I think we've been having this topic almost every week because there's frankly so much going on and so much uncertainty. So Jeff, can you unpack it for us a little bit?
Yeah, thanks, Pete. Thanks for having me back on the program. So I'm just going to dive right into it. There are two things that happened since the last webinar. One was some clarity on the good faith certification that was made when the PPP application was initially made. And the second is the dropping of the forgiveness application, which SBA pleasantly did around 9:30 on Friday night, which was made for a really enjoyable Friday evening in my house. So first is, I think last week we talked a great deal, or maybe the week before, about the good faith certification that was made when an application was submitted. Meaning in good faith, you believe that the monies were necessary to support ongoing operations. There are lots of questions about that particular sentence and the SBA's comments about that regarding additional liquidity or not. The FAQs were updated last week with a FAQ number 46, which basically stated, and I'm going to just put this in a nutshell, that that loans that were $2 million or less were going to be deemed to have been made in good faith and not require really further review or investigation by the SBA during the audit period. Loans in excess of $2 million will be reviewed during the forgiveness period. They will be reviewed to ensure that that certification I mentioned was made in good faith. And if the SBA determines that the certification was not made in good faith, the borrower will have the opportunity to return the monies with no further investigation by the SBA or referral to an outside agency. So it doesn't completely absolve of liability, because I suppose there could be some issue, but for the most part, if the SBA determines that there was a question about the good faith certification, the monies can be returned at that point in time. That answer, that FAQ 46, really brought some relief to a lot of borrowers who are worried about that. So jumping ahead to the loan forgiveness application. So the loan forgiveness application was dropped on Friday. I'm going to try and give some nuggets in the next few minutes here. The application, we can provide a link to it, I'm sure. It can be found at the U.S. Treasury's SBA Paycheck Protection Program website. We can also post a link on our website so that you can find it. Some nuggets that I did want to hit at. One is, I get this question a lot, is how do you determine payroll during the 8-week period? The application does allow borrowers to consider an alternative pay period. Does allow borrowers to consider an alternative pay period, starting with the pay period immediately following the date that you receive the disbursement and continuing for 8 weeks thereafter. So if your pay period doesn't exactly line up with the date of your disbursement of the paycheck loan proceeds, you still have, you don't need to modify your pay periods. You can work off of your regular pay period. And another piece that's important there is that the payroll that's paid and that applies for forgiveness must be paid during that 8-week period. The other costs that are eligible for forgiveness under the paycheck program, we've talked about this a lot, utilities, mortgage interest, and rent. There was some clarity there. I got a lot of questions about whether that was on a cash basis or an accrual basis. The clarity that we've received is that rent obligations, one, need to be incurred during the period, and we're talking about rent on property, on real estate or on personal property. So that was something that I think was some clarity there, that if you are leasing vehicles or copiers or equipment for your business, those types of lease payments will qualify for forgiveness. Secondly, utility payments. And we've gone with this before, electric, gas, water, transportation, telephone, internet are all covered. Again, paid or incurred during the period. Even if an amount incurred during the covered period, but the bill may not be due until after the covered period, that amount can be included in your forgiveness request. I think that was a very helpful piece of clarification there. Now, the amounts, I got a lot of questions about amounts that are paid and included in payroll costs. One of those was like retirement benefits, and the forgiveness application does mention that employer contributions to employee retirement plans that are made during the 8-week period are included. There wasn't really clarification in the application of whether people decide to pay their employer contribution all for the entire year, all in the 8-week period. My assumption is that just that amount that's allocated to the 8-week period would apply. One question that we've got quite a bit is, how do you determine your average FTE count? Is it based on FTEs based on a 30-hour week, a 35-hour week, a 40-hour week? The application does state that the FTE count is based on a 40-hour week. But what they did say is that there's a simplified method that's permitted, which allows you to assign a 1 FTE for employees who work 40 hours or more, but a 0.5 FTE for employees who work fewer than 40 hours. So at the election of the borrower, if you have someone that works any fewer than 40 hours, they can be designated a 0.5. So, I mean, in one sense, you don't need to go redoing all your FTE counts based on a 40-hour week if you normally use a 35 or a 30-hour week. But if you have someone that would have qualified as a 0.75 because they work, 3/4 of the time, Now they will not be a 0.75, they'll be a 0.5. And maybe the thought is that it'll even out for those that work less than half-time or more than half-time. But I thought that was a very important qualifier that's in there. One other area that we've talked about a great deal is those salary changes and reductions in workforce that occurred between February 15th and April 26th. There was some clarity built into the application here with respect to both. The FTE count is actually very clear in terms of restoring those FTEs that you reduced during that period of time. One question that we got quite often is, what if someone is offered a position, doesn't come back to work? What if someone resigns? What if someone retires? What if someone requests a reduction in their hours? So if that occurred, if between February 15th and April 26th, you had any of those events occurred, if those people or those FTEs aren't filled by June 30th, which is the required date for getting the full FTE count on the forgiveness portion, you will have an exception for those people as long as you've documented the fact that someone retired or resigned or requested a reduction of hours. So I think that was some clarity that'll help some employers that may have had a retirement that had nothing to do with the current economic crisis. With respect to the salary reduction, if you remember, between February 15th and April 26th, if you reduce salaries, there has to be a full restoration of those salaries by June 30th, so as to not affect your forgiveness amount. There's a question of whether there'd be any exceptions to that, or whether that applies to all employees, both those that make over 100,000 and under 100,000. Unfortunately, in the application, I did not see clarity on that. So I'm still waiting to see some clarity on the restoration of wages, really for those employees that make over 100,000 who may have had their amount reduced between February 15th and April 26th. And then lastly, I just want to mention, when you do look at the application, on page 10 of the application is a list of documents that you will be required to provide with your forgiveness application. And there's a list that that is suggested that you maintain at your office. They do not need to be provided with the SBA forgiveness application, but there's a list of both items that you'll have to provide and items that you should retain on hand. And they're requiring that all documentation be retained for a period of 6 years after you submit your application. That's on page 10 of the application when you see it. So those are the highlights. It's a lot to unpack. I think that, walking through this application, I think, it tries to be self-explanatory, and I think it does a decent job. There's still some questions that are open, but this gets us a little further along than where we were before Friday night. So that's everything. I'll turn it back over to Pete.
Thanks, Jeff. We are really at our time here, so I guess we should wrap it up. I did just want to say, our goal here is to try and get you as much information as we can of broad general interest. So we're not able to answer all of your specific questions that kind of get down to the level of granularity that people need an answer to. So please call us or email us, reach out to your favorite bond attorney, and we can get you the answer to your specific questions. So thanks very much for being on today. Thanks very much for being our clients and friends of the firm. Everybody take care and stay safe, and we'll talk soon. Thanks.